So unfortunately, Peter Long, I don't think he's going to be able to make it. He was scheduled to do the second presentation today. If he does show up, we can put him on the end. So we'll have Laszlo go first, as scheduled, from the University of Debrecen. Maybe I'm pronouncing that wrong too. It's Hungary. Maybe you can correct me in your introduction. So yeah, and then we'll take questions afterwards. So you can either type it in the box, or if you want to speak out, then we can do that too. But bear in mind, you'll be recorded. And then afterwards, we'll have Paula from Anna Motta from the University of Western Australia. We are actually going to stop recording for Anna's talk. So and she'll explain why. But yeah, please type in questions as you go along in the chat box, and remember to mute your mics and all that. And I'll hand over now to Bori, and I'll mute myself.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me share my screen first. And okay. Can you confirm, please, that you can still see my presentation?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm Bori. I'm a first-year PhD student from the University of Debrecen from Hungary. And today I'm going to talk about Humanimality as it appears in Wes Anderson's Isle of Dogs. And before I properly begin, let me share with you this interesting fact that today many cultural products, texts, read differently than, for example, 2 years ago, because of the coronavirus pandemic. And I believe so is the case with the film I'm talking about today, Isle of Dogs. The movie was released in 2018, but the current pandemic has given a markedly non-anthropocentric meaning to its narrative. So basically, my presentation has a double aim. Today, first of all, I argue that Isle of Dogs is different from the traditional Hollywood representations of canines, because it gives us a less human-centric view on the human-canine relation. And secondly, that in this context of the current global epidemic, it has become even more different because it reminds us of the interrelatedness between animals, humans, and the environment more strongly than ever. Before I start talking about the film itself, let me walk you through the two dominant traditions of representing canines in narrative cinema. The first one mostly appears in the popular genres of family films, adventure films, disaster films, which consistently depict dogs as man's best friend. And this also means that they are almost always anthropomorphized. And as such, are meant to evoke the feelings of empathy, affection in the viewers. So they are used as kind of tools for emotional manipulation. For example, in the case of disaster films like Cruel from 2019, the often miraculous survival of the dog characters also means that the film grants us a kind of satisfaction that a quasi-human character has been saved. So these films highlight humanity both in humans and dog characters. Horror films, by contrast, for example, Cujo, represent dogs as beasts, as monsters that manifest our fear of the non-human other, and in this way highlight animality both in canines and humans. As Stephen Prince argues, the horror genre is motivated by the fear of losing humanity and is always preoccupied with, I quote, the question of how humans may be separated from the rest of the animal world, the question of what human uniqueness consists of, and how it may be kept. By a similar fashion, Margaret Mead argued that, and I again quote, we speak in our current folk language, so in our films, for example, of the beast in man, of the thin veneer of civilization, and either statement simply means that we do not trust mankind to be continuously human. Now, considering these arguments, horror films that portray dogs as beasts basically dramatize this deep-seated controversy of the human condition. this kind of clash between our essentially animal origins and the idea that we are nevertheless somehow superior to and separable from the animal world. And since the canine monsters are usually destroyed by the end of the narrative, horror films again grant us a sense of satisfaction, although quite different from that of family films, for example, that the putative alien, thus menacing animal attack has been averted, and the boundaries of our precarious human identity have been safely restored. Now, Wes Anderson's Isle of Dogs, I believe, mixes the aforementioned two traditions, both of which consolidate an anthropocentric ethics, as I try to illustrate. And if you are not familiar with the film, let me tell you the plot briefly. The film is set in a dystopian Japan, threatened by an apocalyptic dog flu. And to save humanity from the disease, the leader of this fictional city of Megasaki, called Mayor Kobayashi, banishes all canine creatures to the nearby trash island. And although a serum or vaccine is produced eventually by a group of scientists, the mayor refuses to accept this because he wants to secure his political power. He has this anti-canine propaganda, and he refuses to lift the dog ban, and also eventually threatens to exterminate all dogs. Meanwhile, Atari, who is the mayor's nephew, flies to the wasteland to rescue his dog, Spots, that you can see in this photo. But he meets a dog pack, which is led by a stray dog called Chief. And this latter dog becomes his dog and friend, thereby replacing Spots, who has now his own family and pack to fend for on the island. So you can see how Isle of Dogs basically brings together the seemingly two mutually exclusive narrative patterns, because the personal drama of Atari and his dog reinforces human-canine bonding, and at the same time, the element of excluding or isolating dogs elicits the horror of being contaminated by the non-human other. So in this film, the harmless representation of dog, man's best friend, is quite unconventionally transfused with the most threatening type. And I explained the conflict these two types represent through actually two selected theories in the following few minutes. The first theory is the so-called terror management theory, which argues that in our life, we struggle with a basic psychological conflict that arises from having a self-preservation instinct, but at the same time being aware that death is inevitable and to a certain extent, well, unpredictable. And the conflict of these two causes terror, which we usually try to manage through escapism, cultural beliefs that serve to counter biological reality, corporate reality, animality, mortality, and so on, with seemingly more significant forms of value and meaning. And this theory argues that one of the most prevalent cultural values that comfort us with the idea of immortality is this human superiority over animals. Melanie Challenger, in her very recently published book, How to Be Animal, argues that basically any kind of existential threat, for example, the recent pandemic or present pandemic in our real lives, can cause us what she calls the civil war of the mind, which again refers to this collision between the knowledge of being, well, fragile, mortal biological beings, animals, and the narrative, or rather the popular myth of being superior to animals. And again, we try to resolve this conflict by negating, excluding, isolating our corporate reality and animality. And I believe that in Isle of Dogs, it's quite accurately represented how we try to manage this kind of tension. Another theory which approaches the same problem, but from a slightly different perspective, is Kristeva's abjection theory, which argues that the subjective horror or abjection is the feeling when we are confronted with our corporeal reality. For example, the most common examples of this are bodily fluids, or a more extreme one is the human corpse. Now, again, all of these remind us of our mortality, and thus break down or threaten to break down this nicely built up distinction between what is self and what is other, what is me and what is not me. And in many cases, this translates to, again, the separation of the human self and the animal body, which I do not regard as belonging to me, and where Western philosophy has contributed to perpetuate this distinction. And basically, well, we can see how these two theories describe the same phenomenon: this fear, horror, terror, induced by the realization that we are corporeal, biological animal beings, and the reaction of isolating our mind or self, whatever we call it, which ultimately results in a reductive view of what we actually are. And in I Love Dogs, just to reflect again on the film, again, we see accurate representation of this fear, which is resolved by excluding and isolating the animal. However, it's also important to mention that the film calls attention to the fact that we are social animals and that we need to be close to our fellow creatures. Just recall how Otari, the young boy, wants to rescue his dog, and how this is in constant conflict with our need to separate ourselves from the perceived threat caused by the animals and the dog food. And the portrait tension at the heart of the film uncannily foreshadowed the mixed response to human-canine relations during the present pandemic. Although the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention actually confirms that there is no evidence that animals like dogs play a significant role in spreading the disease to people. And actually, humans with the disease are more likely to infect their pets. A few reported cases of ill dogs in China sparked fear among the public at the beginning of last year. And they started disposing of their dogs or sometimes quarantining them. And in some cases, even the local authorities announced that they would kill cats and dogs found in the streets to prevent transmission of the disease. But on the bright side of this situation, the number of pet adoptions has surged, mostly in Western European countries and in the US, for example. So this again shows this kind of tension and the mixed effects of the pandemic on human-canine relations, which actually correlates with the conflict presented by I Love Dogs, the conflict of being animals and at the same time thinking that we are exclusively human. But I think that this conflict is eventually resolved in the film. So let me now return to my first argument, that I Love Dogs is somehow special because it provides us a non-anthropocentric ethics. Well, in this movie, just like in many others, the dog characters are anthropomorphized. Therefore, basically humanity infested, we could say that, because they, for example, speak human language. Also, they carry the labels of human social identification like class. So there are upper class dogs in this film, there are working class dogs and so on. And they also use their minds to save humanity, basically. So ultimately, they are helpers of the human protagonist in the human world. But it's also repeatedly emphasized that they are animals. And to illustrate this, I brought you an example from the movie, a scene, in which two dog packs encounter one another, and they find a bag of garbage, and they stop to discuss whether it is worth to fight over this bag of garbage. And they, in a very sophisticated manner, they discuss this issue among themselves. But after this, they fight, nevertheless. So this shows that the film also accentuates the notion that these are animals, and it not only anthropomorphizes them. At the same time, or by the same token, the human characters are also shown as animals in this movie, because they are prone to be injured, infected, and killed. So they are sort of animality plagued. We see them reanimalized, zoomorphized. And I think that this ultimately makes Isle of Dogs a quite nuanced representation or account about the coexistence and cross infection between different life forms. And it highlights the animality and humanity in both canines and humans. So to wrap this up, let me share with you how the film itself ends. So at the end, the mayor who banishes the dogs to the trash island is confronted with the evidence of his corruption, the serum, and he's also forced to listen to haiku by Otori. And just let me read this out to you briefly. I turn my back on humankind, frost and window pane. Whatever happened to man's best friend, falling spring blossom. Now, I think we can agree that this is about the long-standing close relationship between humans and canines. And it works because it deeply moves the mayor emotionally, who withdraws the trash island decree, and all dogs are brought back to the mainland to be cured. So Isle of Dogs eventually chooses vaccination, and therefore reinforces the notion that the incessant interaction between distinct life forms, in this case virus, dogs, and humans, cannot be arrested, that we are interrelated with animals, that we are also animals, and are embedded in the environment. So even though it's true that what we see in these anthropomorphized characters is ourselves, as Randy Malamud argues, but since these characters carry a zootonic disease, and also they are reintegrated into the community at the end of the narrative, what we see in them is our coronavirus-stricken animal selves. To conclude, I argue that by simultaneously evoking empathy and terror, Isle of Dogs challenges the anthropocentric ethos perpetuated by disaster and horror films, and in this way, it gives way to a non-anthropocentric ethics. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Bori. So I actually have a question before I jump in and read some of these that are coming up in the chat. There's a great talk, and I haven't watched the Isle of Dogs, but I'm definitely gonna go check it out now. And obviously that's a piece of fiction, but I was curious, and you made the connection between the fear of COVID transmission and the effects that is having on abandonment and euthanasia of dogs and cats. And I wonder if you could comment on the media narrative in this sense, so how the media is either hyped or played down and sort of made the narrative, or sorry, I'm tripping over my words, but
yeah, I get it, I think. Okay, so yeah, this was the case in China, and especially the media added fuel to the fire to this public fear that sparked at the beginning of March in 2020, and people obviously focused on the media narrative, or the narrative dispersed by the media, and this also worsened the problem to a great extent. And then it was up to official institutions and groups like animal rights groups and associations to inform the public that no, this is not the case, and they should not focus on social media and media narratives, but the official scientific and biological explanations of this problem. So actually that put an end to this problem, and this was just a short-lived period, fortunately.
Cool, thank you. And actually, Jess, do you want to read out your question so that I don't trip over your words?
Yeah, I absolutely loved that. I thought that was really, really interesting. It's also one of my favorite films and favorite directors, so it's a bit of a treat. So my question was regarding the terror management theory. So I study Kopi Luwak. So it's the world's most expensive coffee. It's produced through civets that eat the coffee, and then the coffee beans taken from the feces.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on terror management theory and how can we, there seems to be a disconnect between that theory and the consumption of certain animal products, whether that's Kopi Luwak or even things like cow's milk. Is there any, I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I believe that in these cases that you mentioned, like Kopi Luwak and like cow's milk, definitely there is, again, I think the media perpetuates this kind of narrative, a popular narrative, which actually, yes, as you suggest, very much goes against the terror management theory. And I don't know what lies at the heart of this kind of contradiction, but it would be very interesting to explore why, in some cases, you know, terror management theory, how to say, prevails, and how in other cases it doesn't have any relevance. So, but probably it has to do with popular narratives, conceptions, and yeah, just like in the case of film. So you can see how in certain cultural representations, our closeness and interrelatedness and like interdependency is highlighted, and in other cases, when actually our purposes, you know, need that kind of justification, we accept this closeness. And in other cases, we do not accept this closeness and try to exclude it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we can carry on a little bit with the questions because it's a bit shorter this session.
Right.
Maybe if Tom wants to ask your question, then if anybody wants to, then I can switch off the camera if anybody has any more questions. So Tom.
Oh yeah, sure. I love that. It was absolutely great. I was thinking about how you were discussing abjection and Kristeva, and you know, normally when we think about Kristeva's objection, in terms of animals, we tend to apply that to farmed animals, the animals that go through industrialized slaughter, and whose bodies were in that garbage that the dogs were fighting over, actually. And so I'm wondering about the use of abjection when it comes to dogs, and why you think Anderson chose dogs to make this point. Do you think it's because of that interrelation that you talked about in the conclusion, or because they better mimic human groups, or I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, good question. Quite complex. So I believe that it was a very conscious choice on the part of Anderson to choose dogs for this film and to bring up the narrative of abjection that can actually be applied to, of course, social abjection and so on and so forth. Because of this very intimate relationship between humans and canines. So maybe one can argue that it is the most intimate relationship between our species and theirs, or animal species. And exactly because of this, or precisely because of this, he had to somehow tackle this conception, this close interrelatedness, and bring it together with the narrative of abjection to make people, you know, think, to trigger some thought about maybe the interrelatedness of us and other animals. So try to extend this kind of more welcoming and accepting conception of the dogs to other animals, like farm animals, as you mentioned. So yeah, maybe, yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Anna, did you want to say your question?
Yeah, thank you. It's not a question per se, but just a comment that there's actually an island in Mexico, in Tanaxpilo, where some scientists brought some macaques in the 1970s, and the island is now abandoned. But initially it was used for some experiments. At the moment, it's used as a touristic attraction mostly. And some people might worry that the island is actually running out of resources to support this growing population of primates. I'm just wondering if maybe if it's worth using a real case study as an analogy to the Isle of Dogs, or what do you think about that? Thanks.
So if I understand it correctly, so there is this island inhabited by primates, you're saying, or not?
So, sorry, yes. Yeah, just an island only inhabited by monkeys. It's in Mexico, actually.
Mm-hmm. And it is threatened by tourists and, okay.
It was it's similar to the case of Isle of Dogs, I think, because it was an island where scientists brought monkeys to do social experiments and behavioral experiments in the 70s, but then it was subsequently abandoned. At the moment, there's no one living in the island except for the monkeys.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was just thinking that could be an interesting case study similar to the movie Isle of Dogs, maybe just to apply some of these theories.
Yeah, I will certainly check it out. Thank you. And it's an interesting analogy. Although I don't know whether animals were banished to go there or put there, or they originally inhabit that area, because that's a difference between this film where the dogs were banished to this island. So people got rid of them and put them there. But yeah, I will certainly check this out. Thank you so much.